Greetings everybody, Eric's UK back with another vid. Been talking about war games lately with Warhammer or what have you, so I thought let's get back to talking about some role-playing games. And today I'm going to talk about one of my top 10, if I have such a thing, role-playing games, which is Rolemaster by ICE, or Iron Crown Enterprises. And to a small extent its sister game MERP, Middle Earth Role Playing. Rolemaster was a game I was introduced to by my friend Chris while we were at school. It came in a box set with 3 books: character lore, arms and claw lore, and spell lore. Rule book, combat book, spell book, basically. And these were fairly basic. They didn't even have proper binding. They were all just stapled through the spine. Nice and cheap. And my copies have long since fallen apart and they're packed away somewhere. I do have some PDF copies somewhere as well on some little floating drive or something, but I haven't looked at them in about 10 years. So you have to forgive me if I'm a little rusty on this one. So basically, Rolemaster was a fantasy role-playing game that was fairly generic. It wasn't designed with any particular world in mind, although over time ICE did introduce Shadow World as their campaign setting, which was a little odd, but you know. Basically, it wasn't a complex system, but it's probably not one of those that's easy for new role players to get into, especially the character creation. I knew it took me a good while to get my head around it. Basically, it was a game that used, I think it was about 8 or 10 stats. That includes your usual like strength, dexterity, constitution sort of thing, but also had things like self-discipline and a couple of odd ones like that. And it was a D100 system. You rolled a D100 and you added your, depending on what race you were, you added a bonus and that was your total. It used an open-ending dice system. So if you rolled, I don't think this worked for the stat generation though, I think this was just for the regular play. But it used an open-ended stat system so that if you rolled a 90 or 100, you rolled again and added it. And you could keep doing this. Likewise, if you rolled 0, 1 to 10, you would roll again and subtract it, and you could keep doing that. I've seen people get the 99 plus and roll again and do it again and do it again. I rarely ever saw anyone get the negatives, and only once or twice can I recall anybody ever actually rolling the negative one and then rolling a positive afterwards and really confusing themselves. But once you'd rolled your stats, put them where you wanted. Yes, I've done it slightly wrong. You would roll the stats, put them where you wanted, and then add the racial bonus. My apologies. You then had to basically pick your profession, as it were. Bear in mind that race-wise, the basic rules were the same sort of thing as you would expect: human, dwarf, elf, I think half-elf and gnome. Not sure about gnome, definitely on halfling. And the classes were a bit odd, because if I remember correctly, the main rules had something like about 12, maybe 15. I'm calling them classes, but I also got a thing in my head that said they were professions or careers or something like that. But you had your fighter, you had wizard, you had ranger, rogue, cleric. But then you had things like animist, sorcerer, mentalist, and it branched off a little bit oddly. In later books, they did a huge slew of books, which was Rolemaster Companions. I think I gave up after like book 5 and an elemental companion. And these were all optional rules, stuff you could add to your game if you wanted to. But they include, every single one included probably about 5 or 6, if not more, new I'll call them classes. They added things like Beastmaster, Elementalist, Montbank, however you pronounce it, Montbank. Not really sure what that one was. And a whole, some very, very odd ones, some very cool ones, but very odd ones. And the way the classes were differentiated, I'm not sure if I've made that word up, they had no special abilities, but everything your character had was designed from its skills. There was no, what's the word? There's no customization really in the game. I mean, this was 1980s and early 90s, so it was very classic, old style sort of role play. You rolled your dice for your stats and whatever. The customization came from skills. Everything was a skill. Your combat abilities with weapons, like one-handed weapon, two-handed weapon, it might even be split into edged and blunt, ranged weapons, pole arms, things like that, were separate skills, and you had to spend skill points on them. And the way you got skill points was from half of your stats, which gave you development points, and you would spend these on your skills. But depending on your class, depended on what skills cost. So if you were a rogue, sneak, for example, might be a 1-to-1, one development point, one skill point. Or one rank, I think it was called. But for a fighter, it might be 4-to-1. So you wouldn't probably have an awful lot of skill points, because your decent stats are going to be in your combat, your strength, dex, con, which didn't generate development points. So your classes were kind of built using your skills, and this is where it starts to get really complex in a way, because when you rolled a skill, it was a D100 plus, I think, 5 times your ranks plus your stat bonus, which was also in 5s, 5, 10, 15, 20, where things like D&D were like 1s, 2, 3, 4s. And sometimes you had to sort of really, until you got the hang of the system, you had to kind of stop and go, right, what exactly am I adding here? So there was no customization, you had no special abilities, there's no feats, no disadvantages. The only thing you had as part of character creation was a really cool thing that I always liked called backgrounds. And you would get a number of backgrounds based on your race, I think it was. I think humans got something like 3 backgrounds, elves got 1, something weird like that. Depending on how good your stat bonuses were and things like that, I think dictated what backgrounds you got. And there was a set of about 5 or 6 background tables, all D100 rolls, and you would roll that, and you would choose, I think you could choose from each one once. And one was things like monetary, so you would gain extra cash. But it could be anything from like an extra D100 gold to something like an extra D1000 tin coins. So you rolled your dice and took your chances. You had one that would give you magical items. So you might get an item that gave you +5 to a skill check. So you might go, well, I'm a rogue, I want a cloak of stealthiness. So you would take a cloak that gave you +5 stealth. As a warrior, you might choose to have a +5 weapon, which would be equivalent to a +1 in D&D. One of the ones that I really liked was it was almost like a supernatural or paranormal background. And one of the options on that, which I remember, was you could be a lycanthrope. And my friend Chris, in one particular campaign I rolled that and was a were-badger. Yep, let that sink in. A were-badger. Always gives me the chuckles. And then you had a certain amount of gold to spend on equipment, and off you went. And the combat system was very, very simple. Your armor gave you an armor type, and there was, I think it was either 1 to 20 or 1 to 50. I think it was 1 to 20. So no armor was like 1, full plate and full tower shield was like 20. and depending on your weapon, you had a whole page in the combat arms law, claw law book, and for that weapon you would roll a d100 and you would go across the chart to the target's AT armor type, and that's how much damage you would do. If it had I think it was a letter value, that was the level of crit you did, and criticals ranged from A to E, E being the best, and your hit points were irrelevant really. If you got an E critical, you were probably dead. Spells worked exactly the same way. If you had a combat spell, you would roll and it would be against the AT, and the better the roll, and again open-ended, you could get 90 or more and roll again and keep going. And they had some very nice tongue-in-cheek entries on critical tables. Once you got critical, you rolled on a specific table for that type of weapon. And I can remember one of the spells was like a sonic spell. If you got a certain good, it basically said that they target is reduced to a quivering blob of jelly. Please try a spatula. And they would put things like that in. The fumble table is exactly the same. I had a MERP game where my barbarian fumbled a greatsword and smacked himself around the back of the head and put himself in a coma for 2 weeks. It was a serious game, but they had a little laugh on the critical and fumble tables. Spells were an odd one. You had to buy your spell lists out of your development points, and spell lists were specific to start with. I think you could buy them after the fact, but they were specific to your class. So Mentalist had a range of 6 spell lists to start with. Wizard had a range of 6 spell lists. Ranger had, and so on. And I'm sure you could expand out of that. And I'm sure if you wanted to spend the development points, your character could actually spend points and say be a fighter and take the necromancy spell list if he wanted to. And these spell lists leveled from 1 to 20, and you had to spend points to keep going. You didn't level up in spell lore like you did in D&D. You don't just get the spells as you level. You've got to spend the points to raise that particular lore. Yeah, and so as you can probably guess, we're 12 minutes in and I've just described the basics of the system. It wasn't probably the easiest to get your head around, and you needed to have a little bit of experience with role-playing games, I think, before you played it. The experience system was a bit odd. Your experience was based on you got experience points for killing things, just like every fantasy role-playing game. You got individual experience points for the critical rating that you inflicted on an opponent based on their level. Doing the same thing with spells would generate you an experience points if you got critical hits on them. It had a really odd one where you earned so much. It's something like 1 XP for every mile travelled, and things like that. But the whole point of the Rolemaster system was that it was, I'm not going to say modular, but you took what you wanted. You had the core system, but then you took what you wanted from anything else. So when they released a Rolemaster companion, it would have optional new weapons, optional new armors. It might give you rules for piecemeal armor. It would give you new classes, new spell lists. It would give you new optional rules for like herb lore or new skill, or and alternate ways of doing magic or combat, but keeping the same sort of system but varying it. And you could pick what you wanted from each book. Most of the time we just took like the classes, the spell laws, the new items, things like that. They did 2, I think it was only 2. They might have done the 3rd one after I stopped, but they did 2 books which were called Creatures and Treasures. And these were your bestiaries. And they didn't go into a lot of detail. They gave you a name, they gave you a set of really blocked up stats. It was often very difficult to get your head around when you first sort of looked through them. and they abbreviated a lot of things without really telling you what the abbreviations were. And again, there was some funny stuff in here. I remember, I think it was in Creatures and Treasures 1, they had a killer rabbit. And in the description it said something along the lines of could be instant killed by use of the HGOA, which for a time you sit there and go, what? And then you go, oh, Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch. HHGOA, sorry. You know, it's the killer rabbit from Monty Python. You had a multitude of creatures. You had your standard orcs, goblins, trolls, whatever. Dragons were really interesting in Rolemaster because they were based on their element. So you had your fire drake, your ice drake, cold drake, acid drake, sonic drake, and when they did the elemental companion, they released things like plasma drakes and ether drakes, and really went to town with that. And dragons were a proper threat in that game. None of this pansy D&D dragons. These were things that you did not mess with if you could help it. But there was something about how the game played that I loved, and I enjoyed running it, and I would love to run it again. It's a shame that the game sort of died out at the end of the 90s. I think ICE went under. I might have to see if I can find some copies on eBay and run it for the guys again, because I loved Rolemaster. And I mentioned MERP, and MERP was Middle Earth role playing, which was they had the ICE had the license for the Middle Earth setting at the time, and their source books were phenomenal, really were. The MERP system was a scaled down version of the Rolemaster system, but what we used to do is just play Rolemaster, take the races from MERP, and the source books were compatible with both games. MERP was kind of more of an introductory thing, and then they probably expected you to go Rolemaster. It wasn't necessarily always fitting with Tolkien's lore, but then that's gaming groups for you, isn't it? I remember when we played back in school, well, no, it was just after that. I think we just left. My friend Chris ran a game, and I was something like a Dunlending barbarian. My friend Jay was a Noldor elf necromancer. AD was something else completely odd, you know, and it doesn't fit, but it does, if that kind of makes sense. Chris was an AD with Tolkien purists, but you could quite happily play this game. And what made the Middle Earth stuff so good, if you've never seen any of the Middle Earth source books, oh my word, absolutely fantastic Angus McBride covers. They went into so much detail. The maps were gorgeous. Sorry, I'm saying I love here, but I've never seen a company put so much effort into source material. Even their own Shadow World source material never got the love and attention that the Middle Earth stuff did. And I've never seen a company put out setting material as wonderful as this. Now, obviously, they expanded on it a little bit themselves. They added elements that obviously aren't going to be covered by Tolkien or his work, but they never messed with the continuity. One of the first books I bought for it was Cirith Ungol of Shelo's Lair, and the default setting for the MERP game, although you could use it at any point, was kind of smack dab in the middle between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Something like the year 2000, I think, was the default for it. And at this point, if I remember correctly, the Tower of Cirith Ungol was actually inhabited by whoever, and it actually named these people and gave them a bit of backstory and what the tower was for and all this stuff that's not covered in any of Tolkien's work, but they expanded on it and gave you source material that was just a pleasure to read and enjoy to run with. They lost that license in the mid-90s, I think, and I think Rolemaster died a few years later. As I say, I think the company went bust sometime in the late 90s. They did another game which I made a character for, I think, They did Space Master, which was a sci-fi version of Rolemaster, and I'm sure I made a character for that at some point. My friend Chris had it. I'm almost positive, but never actually got to play it. Yeah, so Rolemaster was a game that I absolutely loved, and I still do. It just, it wasn't D&D. Every game, I can't describe this any better way. Every game has a feel to me. I can't put it any better way. I don't know how. D&D feels one sort of fantasy. D&D feels what I find as fantasy role-playing game. Rolemaster takes that and gives you a different experience. D&D for me, I know I get these the wrong way around for people, but you know, to me D&D is kind of high fantasy. It's magic is everywhere. Monsters exist. People know they exist. You know that the gods exist. It's fantasy in your face. Rolemaster wasn't like that. Magic, I mean, you had to get probably about 8 or 10 levels of say the fire lore, spell lore, in order to just get a decent fire combat spell. You actually had to have got your character a good ways up before you did it. You know, and even then it wasn't. Oh, even when you got to the high level stuff, it wasn't overpowering. You know, by the time you were facing the monsters and things you were facing, then it wasn't. You balanced out is probably one of the things for Rolemaster. Is a very balanced system because how it worked. Don't know. Sometimes you get a role-playing game that comes along and you just, you know, and it just settles with you so well. And for me, that was Rolemaster. Anyway, I've just noticed I've gone over the 20-minute mark. I don't want to drag out too long. What were your experiences with Rolemaster, if any? Or MERP, or even Space Master if you played it. I would love to know. Any comments or such, drop them down. Tell me any good gaming stories from your Rolemaster days in the comments below. If you enjoyed the vid, hit the like button and subscribe, and I will look forward to seeing you guys on the next video. Thanks for watching, and have a good time. Good English. Have a good day and good gaming.